Ah, my dear one, in the old winters of the colonies, when frost painted lace upon the window panes, there was no sound sweeter than the crackle of the hearth, and no scent warmer than fresh bread. Every home, whether a grand farmhouse or a humble log cabin, had its own rhythm, its own breath, and that breath was yeast and smoke. I remember. The mornings when my grandmother's hands, rough as bark but gentle as dawn, would knead life into flour. She'd hum hymns no one remembers now, the kind that made the dough rise like a slow heartbeat. You see, back then, bread wasn't a comfort, it was survival. The winters came hard, the kind that silenced birds and froze the very breath out of your lungs. Men went to the forests for wood, women to the mills, children to fetch snow water to melt for bacon. Each loaf wasn't just food, it was a promise that the family would see the next moon, the next thaw, the next spring. In that time, when the world was hungry and the earth unyielding, a warm loaf meant the house still had hope. There were no machines, no ovens that hummed, only brick, stone, and flame. The bread was made with patience, coarse flour, salt, water, a handful of wild yeast, and faith. They called it journey bread, soldier's bread, bannock, hard loaf, each name a whisper from a different colony, a different dream. The dough would rest by the fire overnight, covered in linen that smelled of smoke and rosemary. And when morning came, they would bake it in iron pots buried in coals, the kind that gave crusts like armor and hearts soft as clouds. Outside, the cold gnawed at doors. Wolves howled through the trees. The world was vast, untamed, merciless. Inside, the bread steamed gently on wooden tables, the air thick with warmth and laughter. They would break the loaf, pass it around. No one counted slices. The bread counted them. It was more than a meal. It was a ritual. In every crumb was gratitude. In every bite, a whisper of survival. I often think now, the world has grown louder, faster, but emptier too. Back then, they baked not for taste, but for togetherness. The hearth wasn't just a fireplace. It was the soul of the home, the beating heart that kept stories alive. When the bread rose, the spirits of the household rose with it. When the loaf cracked open, it was like the earth itself, breathing life again. And so, as snow drifted and candles burned low, the smell of bread carried through the rafters. It lingered. In the walls, in the hair of children, in the dreams of men far away at sea. That scent was the scent of endurance. The bread was more than food, it was memory, baked into being, a reminder that even in the coldest world, warmth could still be made by hand. But how, you ask, could such simple bread last for months? Ah, that, my dear one, was the alchemy of simplicity, a secret older than time itself.
Ah, my dear one, people today think of bread as something bought, wrapped and sealed, made by machines and timers. But in the old colonial world, bread was a living thing. It breathed, it aged, it spoke, if you knew how to listen. Those old hands, the hands of the bakers, the mothers, the travelers, they did not need recipes. Their knowledge came from feel, the warmth of the room, the smell of the air, the way the dough sighed beneath their palms. There was no secret ingredient. The secret was patience, and patience was the rarest grain of all. The colonists had no yeast packets, no soft white flour. What they had were the gifts of the land, rough stone-ground grains, water from melted snow, and salt carried from the coast. They made their own leaven, called starter or wild yeast, by leaving a bowl of flour and water open by the hearth for days. From the air itself, from the breath of the home, tiny living cultures came, unseen but alive. They would bubble, hiss, rise. The dough would take on the spirit of the place. Each family's bread tasted different because it carried the air of their own hearth, their own smoke, their own season. It was the land captured in a loaf. The old hearths were more than fire pits. They were instruments of life. A baker could tell the temperature not by numbers, but by the color of the coals and the whisper of the ash. Too hot, and the loaf would crack and die. Too cold, and it would fall asleep, never to rise. They watched. They waited. Sometimes they even sang to the dough. A good loaf took time, a whole night of rest beside the fire, rising slowly as the embers dimmed. The next morning, when the rooster crowed, the dough had become something else entirely, lighter, gentler, alive. This was the alchemy of simplicity, turning flour, water, and salt into sustenance that could last through winter's hunger. Before science had a name, long before laboratories or thermometers, colonial bakers understood fermentation by instinct. They knew that wild yeast fed on sugars and exhaled air, a breathing partnership between man and microbe. To them it wasn't science, it was spirit, the invisible hand of providence, and yet it was perfect chemistry, acid and air balancing to make a loaf that could resist rot for months. The crust, baked hard and dark, sealed the softness within. It was armor for nourishment, protection against damp, mold, and time. When cooled and kept in linen or wooden boxes, that bread could last weeks, even months, without spoiling. Sailors took it to sea, soldiers carried it in packs, and families stored it in cool pantries beside salt meat and candles. In that bread was the science of endurance, learned not in books, but in the quiet watching of the hearth. The colonial kitchen was no factory. It was a shrine of tools made by hand and memory, heavy wooden spoons polished by generations, iron pots blackened by smoke, baking stones smoothed by decades of fire. The Dutch oven, an iron pot with a lid, became the heart of the craft. They would heap coals on top and around it, trapping heat like an ancient spell. Inside, silence, patience, and transformation. The smell of baking bread would fill the cottage, sharp, earthy, sacred. Children would wake to it before dawn, smiling in their sleep. It was the smell of life continuing. Each loaf told a story. You could taste the harvest in it, the good rains, the harsh winds, the grind of the millstone. Bread from the coast had the faint scent of salt air. Bread from mountain valleys carried the taste of pine smoke and cold river water. And in every home, each woman or man who baked left a trace of their own soul behind. A loaf baked in love kept its warmth longer. That's what the elders said, and they were not wrong. In the flickering candlelight, they would whisper prayers over the dough. Rise well, keep strong, feed us through the frost. The bread rose not just from yeast, but from faith. The secret of colonial bread's endurance was simple yet perfect. Long fermentation made it acidic, unfriendly to mold. The thick crust, baked in fire and smoke, sealed it like stone. And the flour, whole, unrefined, rich in oils and fiber, aged gracefully rather than rotting quickly. Stored in cool pantries wrapped in linen, the loaves hardened, yes, but they did not decay. To soften them again, they would steam them by the fire or soak them in broth. Some loaves were even baked twice. Biscuit bread, hard as iron, but everlasting. Soldiers joked that it could break teeth, but they were grateful for its loyalty when the snow came and the fields were empty. Bread that survived months was not a miracle of technology. It was a marriage of patience and flame. The human hand. Every baker, every mother, every weary traveler was an alchemist, not with gold or silver, but with grain and fire. The dough became their canvas, their comfort, their legacy. They shaped it with stories, stories of home, of hunger, of hope. Sometimes they added herbs, rosemary, sage, or even ashes of grapevine, not for taste, but preservation. Others brushed the crust with honey to seal it, creating a sweetness that kept away the damp. Each touch of the hand mattered. The warmth of skin, the rhythm of kneading, all part of the spell. When you hold an old loaf now, you're holding fingerprints of the past. The warmth of forgotten hands still lingers there. The hearth was not just a place, it was a companion. They fed it wood as they would feed a friend. They listened to its sighs and sparks. The bread rose in its breath, baked in its belly, cooled in its warmth. The hearth had moods, sometimes gentle, sometimes fierce. To master bread was to understand the fire, its patience, its hunger, its gift. And when the loaf emerged, dark and perfect, the baker would always pause, silent for a moment, to thank the flame. Today, we've traded that slow magic for speed, for soft white loaves that die in days. The bread no longer carries the breath of the home, only the hum of machines. But the lesson of the old ways remains. That true preservation isn't just about keeping bread from spoiling. It's about keeping meaning alive. Those colonial loaves lasted months because they were made with time, care, and reverence. They were food meant not just for the body, but for the heart. Proof that patience could outlast hunger and that simplicity could conquer time. And so, my dear one, when the bread rose and the crust sealed like stone, it wasn't just flour becoming food. It was man learning to turn hardship into hope. The hearth keepers knew this truth well, and their craft became their faith. In those long-ago mornings, before the roosters called and the frost began to melt from the thatched eaves, the hearth keepers of the 1600s would rise in silence. The air was bitter, the kind that bit the skin and filled your breath with smoke. Yet even before the world stirred, the first sound to greet the dawn was the soft thud of kneading hands against wood. The old ones, the mothers, the widows, the apprentices, they treated that dough not as mere food, but as a living thing. They whispered to it. They tested it with fingertips that had learned warmth by heart. And when they stirred the ashes and breathed life into the coals, the fire didn't just light the home, it lit the day's very spirit. You could tell a good home, they said, by how early the smoke rose from its chimney. That was the mark of the hearth keeper, a soul who turned hunger into harmony, one loaf at a time. Hands, those were their stories, rough, cracked, and worn. Every scar spoke of seasons survived, every callous a winter conquered. A hearth keeper didn't need a clock. The dough told time better than any bell. When it sighed, it meant the yeast was alive. When it resisted, the day was still too cold. And when it felt light beneath the palms, the keeper knew the fire was ready. In those hands was more than strength. There was rhythm, there was patience, there was prayer. Every press of palm to dough, every fold, every dusting of flour was a hymn to survival, wordless yet eternal. To watch them was to see faith made flesh. The fire was not a tool, it was a friend, a guardian, sometimes even a god. It demanded respect. If you ignored it, it sulked, smoked, and died. If you tended it with care, it rewarded you with light and warmth. The hearth-keepers learned to read its moods. They could tell by the color of the flame whether the bread would bake hard or soft. They'd crouch before it, eyes glowing like amber, whispering small thanks before laying in the loaves. You see, in the cold of those centuries, the fire was more than heat. It was memory. It remembered yesterday's spark, and with a little coaxing, carried it into tomorrow. That's why they called it the living heart of the house. From sunrise to nightfall, life revolved around that rhythm. Grind, knead, bake, share. The sound of the paddle striking the oven floor, the hiss of steam escaping the loaf, the hum of quiet conversation. It was their music. When one hearth-keeper's fire went out, another lent a coal. When a neighbor's flour spoiled, someone shared their own. It wasn't charity, it was law, the law of survival and warmth. To break bread together was more than to eat. It was to promise, I will not let your fire die. At day's end, when embers burned low and the world outside turned silver with moonlight, the hearth became their teacher. The elders sat close, telling stories not from books, but from memory, about storms weathered, harvests lost, and miracles found in the smallest crumb. Children would sit, wide-eyed, hands sticky with honeyed crust, listening to words that rose and fell like the crackling logs. And though they might forget the stories, they never forgot the feeling, that strange safety that came from the glow of fire and the smell of bread. That's the wisdom that built homes stronger than stone. That warmth doesn't just come from fire. It comes from people who keep it alive. There was art in the way they worked, though no one called it art then. The way flour rose like snow in sunlight, the way loaves rested under linen like sleeping children, the way every burn mark on the oven wall told of effort and love. They didn't bake for beauty, but beauty found them anyway, in the curves of a well-shaped loaf, the harmony of tools lined up on the sill, the glow of pride in weary eyes. They didn't need applause. The quiet crackle of cooling bread was their applause. To be a hearth-keeper was not to be noticed. It was to keep the unnoticed alive. Ask any old hearth-keeper, they'll tell you, bread isn't made of wheat alone. It carries fingerprints of the soul. Every loaf that rose in those centuries held laughter, grief, and prayer in equal measure. When someone passed away, their oven was kept burning for a day in their honor, as if their warmth could linger one loaf longer. When a child was born, a small roll was baked just for them, a promise that they would never know hunger. The bread connected them to each other, to their ancestors, and to the land that gave them its grain. It was, in every sense, communion. At night, after the loaves cooled and silence settled, the hearth-keeper would sit alone for a while, the room dim, lit only by the dying orange glow of embers. The smell of baked crust still hung in the air mixed with smoke and pine. He would rest his elbows on his knees, stare into the fire, and think of all that day had given, and all it had taken. The bread was done, the fire had earned its sleep, but the keeper stayed, a silent guardian, watching over warmth itself. That was the truest kind of peace, not rest, but stillness. Centuries later, when only ruins remain and hearths crumble into ash, the scent still lingers. If you walk through an old stone kitchen after rain, you can still smell it, a trace of charred flour, smoke, and time. That scent, that invisible ghost, is the memory of hands that refuse to let cold win. It is the soul of Candlehearth 1600s, quiet, glowing, eternal. They never wrote their names. Their faces are gone, their voices dust, their loaves long eaten. But every time a hand lights a fire, every time dough meets wood, their craft is reborn. We call them hearth keepers, not because they baked bread, but because they kept something far rarer alive, the human warmth that survives the coldest centuries. The taste of memory. When I was a boy, I remember my grandfather breaking a crust so firm you'd think time itself had baked it. He said, "This bread is older than me, lad. Not the loaf, but the way it's made." Every family in the old world guarded their recipe like a prayer, a small thread in the great cloth of survival. The smell of that crust carried not just hunger, but history, the echo of countless hands that had kneaded before ours. You could taste the winters it had endured, the laughter it had heard, and the silent faith that had kept it alive. That old bread was never soft. It met the knife like stone meets steel, unyielding, proud. But that was its secret. The harder it was, the longer it lasted. In a world that froze food and bone alike, toughness meant love that refused to die. Colonial families baked with purpose, not indulgence. They baked for the child who would eat it a month from now, for the traveler crossing an ocean, for the hope that tomorrow would still have warmth in it. Each crack on that crust was a mark of endurance, a scar of fire and faith intertwined. The bread that outlived its makers long after the hands that shaped it were gone, the method remained. Villages rebuilt, ovens crumbled, generations passed. But someone, somewhere, would still stir flour and water and salt, whispering the same old prayer for patience. In every crumb, there was the voice of the past saying, "We were here. We endured. The bread became a messenger, carrying stories across centuries like letters sealed in heat." Even now, when a modern oven hums and electric light fills the room, the spirit of the old hearth flickers quietly in the corner. You see it when families gather to eat, when laughter echoes against walls that once heard silence, when hands reach out for warmth without even realizing why. That's the old world calling, the memory of shared hunger and shared hope. And if you listen closely, you'll hear it in the crack of a crust, the same sound our ancestors once heard when they thanked the fire for staying one more night. Some say nothing lasts forever, but the bread of the 1600s in its own humble way does, not as a thing you can touch or taste, but as a lesson needed deep into us all. It teaches that what we build with patience and care outlives us. It reminds us that faith, like yeast, works unseen, and that a simple act, baking bread for tomorrow, can echo through centuries. And maybe, just maybe, that's what our ancestors meant when they called it daily bread, not just for the body, but for the heart that refuses to go cold.